So welcome to week 2 of Tech 502, and in this lecture I'm going to talk about historical developments in the timber industry. Now this is a syllabus dot point. It was added to the industrial technology syllabus back in 2013, and it's a really good way in the context of the industry study to draw together a whole lot of different aspects of other syllabus dot points in the industry study. And you know, if a student was asked about historical developments in the timber industry in an HSC examination, you'd be wanting them to try to show the marker a broader knowledge of the industry study section of the syllabus. And you'll see how I bring it out in this presentation. So it's historical developments in the timber industry, and specifically we're going to look at their impact on manufacturing processes, materials and work practices. So you can already see there that there's some terminology coming up that is found in other parts of the syllabus. So let's start from the beginning. So we'll break it up into a few different sort of time periods. So let's look at the early colonial period from 1788 through to around about 1850. And those of you who know a little bit of Australian history could probably work out what's going on at the beginning and what's going on at the end there of those dates. So very soon after European settlement of Australia, a very small furniture making industry arose, and it comprised of small workshops with skilled craftsmen using hand tools. And they were really working in two markets. So there was obviously a need in Australia to produce our own furniture here, as it's a long 6-month sea voyage from England at this time, and furniture is quite bulky, and you can imagine that would be quite expensive to be shipping furniture out from Europe. So obviously there was a domestic market. But the other thing too is that they found out very quickly that Australian forests contain very useful and very valuable timbers. And I've got two fairly early examples of furniture here. And in some ways they kind of represent, what I just said there before. So the sofa that you can see on the left there, that's obviously a very ornate item and would have been a very, very valuable piece of furniture. So really that was made for either for, the very highest end of the market here in Australia. You're probably looking at top government officials, or it would have then been shipped back to Europe. So it's interesting because it's a red cedar sofa, but they didn't have red cedar in Tasmania. So it was obviously harvested probably in New South Wales and then shipped down there to a particular manufacturer, particular craftsman, who made that, quite amazing piece of furniture. And then that, was sold off in the market there. You can see on the other side here, you've got this specimen cabinet, which is actually made out of she oak, which is a really attractive timber, but it's not one that's widely worked with outside of very specialist applications. But this is really important because it's actually the earliest piece of furniture that we know that was made here in Sydney, and it was made by a cabinet maker called James Packer in Sydney in 1815. Around about that time, there was two furniture makers in Sydney at the time, and James Packer was one of them. I've got a link to some more information on early colonial furniture at the end of this presentation as well. Now this one, was probably made for somebody here in Australia, but it did get shipped back to England, and it was found back there. So there's some examples of very early Australian furniture. And so the very valuable material that they found was Australian cedar, which is Tuna ciliata. It's a relatively soft timber to work with, and it's very easy to work, easy to carve and shape and join and do all sorts of things like that. But really, where its value came from was it was very similar to European mahogany, which was traditionally, in the European context, was considered to be sort of the timber that the wealthy used to make their furniture from. And by this stage, European mahogany was getting quite rare. It was very hard to find enough to make furniture out of solid mahogany, and so it was being used a lot as veneers. And so, it would certainly would be a real sign of conspicuous wealth if you had solid mahogany furniture. So this cedar that was found in Australia was very quickly realised that was a great new source of something that was quite similar to mahogany. So it was quite prized. And what that meant was there was a group of people called the cedar getters, and they actually went all the way through the forests of New South Wales, Queensland, where it grows. And pretty much by around about 1880, they'd cut down nearly all of the cedar. It's a very extremely rare timber today. Most cedar that is being used today is either from more recently grown trees, it's very slow growing, or it's recycled from cedar that had been harvested previously and repurposed. So early colonial furniture was usually made from solid timbers. So we didn't use veneers here. We didn't have to. We had a lot of timber to start off with. And as I said, veneers were being used in Europe a lot more. So like I was saying before, they'd either make the furniture here in Australia or they would ship the timber back and it would be manufactured in Europe. And again, when you think about that, when you're putting large pieces of timber onto relatively small ships for incredibly long voyages, the original sort of voyages from England to Australia would take up to 6 months. They obviously got faster with practice and faster ships, but they never got it down underneath a couple of months or a month and a half. Where with the fast T clippers could do it in about a month and a half, but that was much later. But and as I sort of alluded to with the cedar getters, forests, even at this early stage, were being unsustainably exploited. So most cedar was removed by the 1880s, and many other species were becoming harder to access. A really good example is a timber called coachwood, and you'll find old teacher desks in schools, like old solid timber teacher desks in schools, were often made from solid coachwood. So if you ever see any of those getting thrown out in schools, grab them, and if you're as a woodworker, you can use the timber in it, but they're extremely valuable. So don't let them throw them out. But also, obviously the population in Australia was growing, but then particularly after the gold rushes of the 1850s, massive increase in demand for timber products. And if you think about what other technologies were coming along at around about that time, you can start to understand what's going on. So, of course, we needed it for furnishings. We needed the timber for furnishings. We needed it for construction. Building frames, roofs, cladding, panelling, all that sort of thing. But here's the big one, the railways, the timber railway sleeper. And specifically, it was ironbark that they were after for railway sleepers. So you can see that image there. It's very small down the bottom. The caption is, they are sleeper hewers. So for many years, there was a substantial industry in Australia for people to cut sleepers for the railways. And what they found is that the best timber for that task in Australia was ironbark. And so we get to the beginning of managed forests. So special forest reservations were set aside to ensure a supply of hardwood railway sleepers. This was really seen to be a strategic importance. So it basically meant that there were large forests in parts of New South Wales in particular and up into Queensland that was specifically set aside, and the only logging activity that could happen in those forests was for the purposes of recovering timber for railway sleepers. And of course, furniture manufacturing increased in scale. Now you'll see here, so of course, as furniture manufacturing increases in scale, we understand that as businesses grow, so you can see how I'm linking this back to industry study. As businesses grow, it tends to make sense to do something that we call specialisation. And that's where skilled workers would specialise in one particular area of production, increasing output and efficiency. And for example, I mean, if I can use the Department of Education teacher desks as an example. You would not say, I've got 1,000 desks to make, so I'm going to employ 1,000 people to make one desk each. You would have different people specialising in different areas. So you'd have somebody making legs, somebody making tops, somebody joining the timber, somebody finishing it, applying finishes, whatever. It kind of makes sense, really. So, but it's good for the student, particularly if the student is talking about historical developments, they've been asked to talk about historical developments, that they connect their discussion with other aspects, other dot points in the syllabus. And specialisation is one of those. And here comes some more. So larger companies could also invest in machinery. So it's the beginning of mechanisation. And again, you can see how this is being linked back to other areas in the syllabus. So the earliest machines that they could mechanise were table saws, drilling machines and moulding machines. Now we're talking pre-electricity here. So generally how it worked is they would have a big steam engine somewhere down in the end of the factory, and then they would have a series of belt drives that would go throughout the factory, and they could then hook into table saws, drilling machines, moulding machines. They had sort of a lever and gear system where you could hook your machine up to this belt drive and when you needed to use it. Now, of course, that had some benefits, but it's also, a lot less efficient than, what comes down the track, because it meant that the machines were pretty much fixed in place, and there was a limit to how many machines you could run off your steam engine. It was also a little bit inefficient in the sense that the steam engine itself had to pretty much run all the time, whether the machines were running or not. And also at the same time, there's this growing realisation that our forests are a finite resource. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we'd already cut down all of the cedar. We were concerned about the supply of ironbark, and a whole lot of other really nice, useful species were basically being cut out of our forests. And as a result, New South Wales again was the first with this, closely followed by Victoria and Queensland, South Australia, were the first forest reserves. So they were proclaimed in New South Wales in 1871. And then we started into our first commercial pine plantations in 1912. And then the Forestry Commission of New South Wales in 1916. And then different bodies in different states after that. Yeah, and basically this is the charter of the Forestry Commission, the management of native and plantation forests in New South Wales to ensure a sustainable supply of timber into the future. That's their role. They still exist today. Okay, you can probably see what's coming with what you can see in these images here. So technology moves on. Now electrification, and it's really important not to underestimate the impact of electricity. As I said before, before you'd have to have a steam engine and some sort of belt drive mechanism. But once you've got electricity or access to electricity, firstly, everything becomes a lot more flexible, a lot more portable, and also a lot smaller, a lot more compact. So it really does bring much, greater degree of productivity improvement at this time. Yeah, so and also you can have more sophisticated machinery. So you'll still have your table saw, which is obviously a very important piece of equipment, but you can now have smaller drills. You can have different, rather than big molding machines, you can actually have routers of different sizes for different processes. So some of the finer work can be done with smaller handheld routers and more sophisticated machinery. And so now we're really coming into, we're going to start sort of experiencing mass production techniques where we've got kind of production lines happening. And you can see here, I mean, we're not quite at mass production yet, but in those images that you see, they're actually building aircraft. And of course, which means World War One. So World War One, aircraft were made from timber, but of course the war meant a whole bunch of other things. It just meant that there was a lot more activity. There was more shipbuilding, more construction of different kinds, but also this desire or need, particularly when you've got submarines out there sinking ships, this need in Australia to become more self-sufficient. Then we come along to the Great Depression, and again, those of you who know history, Australia was hit particularly hard by it. I think we had unemployment rates of up to 30%, and it was a pretty tough time. But then along came World War II, and that brought with it a whole lot of economic activity. So again, in World War II, there was another massive increase in demand for timber products as we scrambled to construct facilities for our growing military. And also there was a bit of material replacement going on. Steel in particular was really needed for things like shipbuilding, tanks, guns, that sort of thing. So there were some areas where things that were made from metal were going back to being made out of wood. As a little bit of a side note, the de Havilland Mosquito was a fighter bomber, World War II fighter bomber, and it was made completely out of timber frames and plywood sheeting. And it was a fantastic aircraft. And one of the motivations for that aircraft was that the Air Ministry did not want to have another aircraft on its books because they were short of aluminium in particular, and it was the de Havilland company that came along and said, well, I'll tell you what, how about we make it out of wood? And they did, and it was a fantastic aircraft. They also made them in Australia as well. Okay, so then we move out of the war. The 1950s, the lucky country. So that's where, we talk about riding on the sheep's back. And we also we've decided that from our experience from World War II, we needed to get more people in the country. So we opened our doors for the first time for immigration. The Snowy Mountains scheme was a particular one where a lot of people came out from Europe, emigrated from Europe to work on the Snowy Mountains scheme. And then we had very high commodity prices. So, they say riding on the sheep's back. That's because wool was very, very sought after, particularly in the early 1950s when the Korean War was going on. Very cold place in winter, and it was Australian merino wool that kept the soldiers warm. And as a result, there was a lot of money flowing into Australia. So we were one of the wealthiest countries on earth at that time. In terms of technology, so we're starting to see the beginnings of high tech, or what we might call high tech. So the first numerical control machines appear, and so we're talking the 1950s. So when we talk about CNC machines like routers, we're talking about computer numerical control. But the version that came before that was what we call numerical control. So they're not guided by a computer, but they're still programmable, and they can still do the things that CNCs can do today. The other thing we're seeing is the development of manufactured timber products. So I talked about the Mosquito fighter bomber in World War II that used plywood. And you can see plywood was one of the earliest manufactured timber products. So its development sort of started in about 1865, but it really didn't sort of come to fruition until about 1925. And that has to do with the development of the glues. Masonite, or HDF, high density fiberboard, was around 1925. And then surprisingly, even though it's the one that we seem to use the most, MDF, which is medium density fiberboard, that sort of came along in the 1960s. Now, when you think about this, we've got to talk about particle board as well, which we also call chipboard, so around about the 1940s. Yeah, and this is where I want to talk about how there's a whole lot of different technologies are starting to come together and starting to come to fruition. So all of these technologies, so all of the manufactured boards, benefited from the development and availability of phenolic resins through the Second World War. And so when you think about it, glues and adhesives, they actually haven't been around in their modern form for very long. And they've had a fairly, profound impact on basically furniture manufacturing and what we can do in terms of timber products. And that's what I'm sort of talking about now, convergence. So we're talking about a convergence of a range of technologies to create a new thing. And you'll see. So manufactured boards, along with numerical control and then CNC machinery from the 1960s, leads to mass-produced furniture. So this is where furniture is now changing quite dramatically. Flat packing, that comes along as a concept. And can any of you guess what's coming next? IKEA. And when I say IKEA, I mean, I'm using that as an example, but IKEA was really one of the earliest companies. They got going in I'm trying to remember now, I thought it was in the 1960s, could have been earlier than that. But basically where they identified these technologies, the convergence of these technologies. We've got manufactured boards, we've got numerical and then computer numerical control machinery. We can now mass produce flat pack furniture. And that's had a profound impact on the timber products industry, not only in Australia, but around the world. Now, when we think about this, it's got positives and negatives for the industry in Australia. So it's more efficient. There's less waste. Theoretically, there is, but there should be. You can nest, all of your parts on, efficiently onto a large sheet of manufactured board, and then you can have a computer come along and cut it out for you. So theoretically, there should be less waste. But the big problem is it can be made cheaply overseas and imported. And that's really the reality in Australia, that there is some flat packing manufacturing that happens in Australia. It's a little bit more bespoke, I suppose. Things like built-in wardrobes, kitchens, where they actually have to fit into particular spaces. Obviously, it makes sense for those sorts of processes to be done not only in Australia but relatively locally. That's why you'll find any town, suburb or whatever of reasonable size is not far from a business that will do those sorts of things. Cabinet makers, kitchen companies, those sorts of companies. But in terms of a lot of household furnishings, a lot of that is now imported. So what about the future? Well, we still have a comparatively well-managed forest resource. Even though we've, cut down, some species have become very rare and basically non-commercial anymore, we still have access to, relatively unique hardwood species in particular. in a managed forest resource that is, much better than many other countries around the world. Like I said, we have unique species, so we actually have a product that pretty much other countries don't have, even though, in places like South America and Brazil, South Africa I meant, and South America, but particularly Brazil, have actually taken Australian eucalyptus species and are growing them over there in plantations. We still have, these unique species. We've also got significant softwood plantations. Although from the last unit, you've realised that the growth in our softwood plantations is not actually keeping up with demand in Australia for, softwood for construction purposes in particular. And we do have an increasing stock of plantation hardwoods, such as blackbutt, Tassie blackwood in particular, and blue gum as well. The other thing too to consider, as neighbouring countries develop, demand for our product increases. I mean, when I originally sort of looked at that, I was thinking about China, but obviously things have gone a bit haywire there. But also when you look at countries like Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, they're developing at a very rapid pace, and there's a class of people, an increasing sized class of people in those countries that are actually relatively wealthy and are interested in the unique products that we can offer them. And Australia itself is still relatively wealthy, and we're supporting a fairly strong domestic demand. And there is this sort of, it's not so much a backlash to, say, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, flat pack IKEA type furniture, but there has been a change in styles and tastes, which, even though people are a lot more minimalistic these days, they certainly do value, high value one-off pieces. And here's an example. So this is Evan Dunstan, who operates just outside of Canberra, and you can look up his website. But this piece here, made from Tasmanian blackwood, beautifully made, is one of his signature pieces that retails around about $15,000 a piece, and there is a market for that. Evan employs a number of people. He has a number of construction teams there that work for him, and and they're fully employed, quite busy producing beautiful pieces of very, very high quality furniture. Now, what are the challenges? So, of course, climate change. And I think, that was brought home only a couple of years ago with the recent bushfires. Now, they have had and are continuing to have and will have into the future significant impacts because large amounts of our East Coast hardwood stocks were burnt out, particularly spotted gum. Now, at the moment, we're a little bit inoculated from that because what's been happening is that they've been going in, and where timber is burnt but can be salvaged, they've been going in and salvaging that timber. So that's actually, in the shorter term, maintained supply. But where the problem is that there's going to be a 20 to 30 year sort of drop off where we've got to get new trees growing to a harvestable size. So we are going to feel that. And as I mentioned before, there's increasing demand. It is a finite resource. It's not like we're necessarily planting more forests. So we've only got the forest that we've got, but the demand is increasing, particularly around in the area of construction timber, and it's very hard to keep up with supply. And so we've come to the end. I do have a couple of links there. There's this one here goes back to the information, basically where the information came from, where I was talking about the history of early colonial woodworkers. There's an article there which is actually quite interesting if you're into that sort of thing. That gives a lot more detail on the early history of colonial furniture making in Australia. And then there's a video, a link to a video to the history of forestry in New South Wales. Thank you.